Good wishes to all of you. Textbook in History for Class 12. Themes in Indian History Part 1. Theme 4. Thinkers, Beliefs and Buildings. Cultural Developments. See 600 before Common Era to 600 Common Era. Take a look at figure 4.1, a sculpture from Sanchi. Take a look at figure 4.2, Shah Jahan Begum. In this chapter, we shall go on a long journey across 1,000 years to read about philosophers and their attempts to understand and world they inhabited. We will also see how their ideas were compiled as oral and written texts as well as expressed in architecture and sculpture. These are indicative of the enduring influence these thinkers had on people. While we will be focusing on Buddhism, it is important to remember that this tradition did not develop in isolation. There were several other traditions, each engaged in debate and dialogues with the others. The sources that historians use to reconstruct this exciting world of ideas and beliefs include Buddhist, Jaina, and Brahmanical texts, as well as a large and impressive body of material remains, including monuments and inscriptions. Among the best preserved monuments of the time is the stupa at Sanchi, which is a major focus in this chapter. A glimpse of Sanchi. Sanchi in the 19th century. The most wonderful ancient buildings in the state of Bhopal are at Sanchi, Kankera, a small village under the brow of a hill some 20 miles northeast of Bhopal, which we visited yesterday. We inspected the stone sculptures and statues of the Buddha and an ancient gateway. The ruins appeared to be the object of great interest to European gentlemen. Major Alexander Cunningham stayed several weeks in this neighborhood and examined these ruins most carefully. He took drawings of the place, deciphered the inscriptions, and bored shafts down these domes. The result of his investigation were described by him in an English work. From Shahjahan Begum, Nawab of Bhopal, ruled 1868 to 1901. Taj ul Iqbal Tariq Bhopal, A History of Bhopal, translated by H.D. Barstow, 1876. 19th century Europeans were very interested in the stupa at Sanchi. In fact, the French sought Shah Jahan Begum's permission to take away the eastern gateway, which was the best preserved, to be displayed in a museum in France. For a while, some Englishmen also wanted to do the same. But unfortunately, both the French and the English were satisfied with a carefully prepared plaster. Cast copies and the original remained at the site, part of the Bhopal state. The rulers of Bhopal, Shah Jahan Begum and her successor Sultan Jahan Begum, provided money for the preservation of the ancient site. No wonder then that John Marshall dedicated his important volumes on Sanchi to Sultan Jahan. She funded the museum that was built there as well as the guest house where he lived and wrote the volumes. She also funded the publications of the volumes. So, if the stupa complex has survived, it is in no small measure due to wise decisions and to good luck in escaping the eyes of railway contractors, builders, and those looking for finds to carry away to the Museum of Europe. One of the most important Buddhist centers, the discovery of Sanchi has vastly transformed our understanding of early Buddhism. Today, it stands testimony to the successful restoration and preservation of a key archaeological site by the Archaeological Survey of India. Take a look at figure 4.3, the Great Stupa at Sanchi. If you travel from Delhi to Bhopal by train, you will see the majestic stupa complex on top of a hill, crowing it as it were. If you request the guard, he will stop the train at the little station of Sanchi for 2 minutes, enough time for you to get down. As you climb up the hill, you can see the complex of structures, a large mound and other monuments, including a temple built in the 5th century. Discuss. Compare what Shah Jahan Begum described with what you see in figure 4.3. What similarities and differences do you notice? Source 1. A prayer to Agni. Here are two verses from the Rig Veda invoking Agni, the god of fire, often identified with the sacrificial fire into which offerings were made so as to reach the other deities. Bring, O strong one, the sacrifice of ours to the gods, O wise one, as a liberal giver, bestow on us, O praised, abundant food, Agni, obtained by sacrificing mighty wealth for us. Procure, O Agni, forever to him who prays to you the gift of nourishment, the wonderful cow. May a son be ours, offspring that continues our line. Verses such as these were composed in a special kind of Sanskrit known as Vedic Sanskrit. They were taught orally to men belonging to priestly families. List the objectives of these sacrifices. But what is the significance of this monument? Why was the mound built and what did it contain? Why is there a stone railing around it? Who built the complex or paid for its construction? When was it discovered? There is a fascinating story that we can uncover at Sanchi for which we must combine information from text, sculpture, architecture, and inscription. Let us begin by exploring the background of the early Buddhism tradition. The background, sacrifices, and debates. The mid first millennium BC is often regarded as a turning point in world history. It saw the emergence of thinkers such as Zarathustra in Iran, Kongji in China, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in Greece, and Mahavira and Gautama Buddha, among many others in India. They tried to understand the mysteries of existence and the relationship between human beings and the cosmic order. This was also the time when new kingdoms and cities were developing and social and economic life was changing in a variety of ways in the Ganga Valley, chapter 2 and 3. These thinkers attempted to understand these developments as well. The sacrificial tradition. There are several pre existing traditions of thought, religious belief, and practice, including the early Vedic tradition known from the Rig Veda, compiled between c. 1500 to 1000 before Common Era. The Rig Veda consists of hymns in praise of a variety of deities, especially Agni, Indra, and Soma. Many of these hymns were chanted when sacrifices were performed, where people prayed for cattle, sons, good health, long life, etc. At first, sacrifices were performed collectively. Later, c. 1000 BCE to 500 BCE onwards. Some were performed by the heads of household for the well-being of the domestic unit. More elaborate sacrifices such as the Rajasuya and Ashwamedha were performed by chiefs and kings who depended on Brahmana priests to conduct the ritual. New questions. Many ideas found in the Upanishads 6th century BC onwards show that people were curious about the meaning of life, the possibility of life after death, and rebirth. Was rebirth due to past actions? Such issues were hotly debated. Thinkers were concerned with understanding and expressing the nature of the ultimate reality, and others outside the Vedic tradition asked whether or not there even was a single ultimate reality. People also began speculating on the significance of the sacrificial tradition. Debates and discussion. We get a glimpse of lively discussions and debates from Buddhist texts, which mention as many as 64 sects or schools of thought. Teachers traveled from place to place, trying to convince one another as well as laypersons about the validity of their wells as laypersons, about the validity of their philosophy or the way they understood the world. Debates took place in the Kutgarshala, literally a hut with a pointed roof on it, or in grooves where traveling mendicants halted. If a philosopher succeeded in convincing one of his rivals, the followers of the latter also became his disciples. So, support for any particular sect could grow and shrink over time. Many of these teachers, including Mahavira and the Buddha, questioned the authority of the Vedas. They also emphasized individual agency, suggesting that men and women could strive to attain liberation from the trials and tribulation of worldly existence. This was in marked contrast of the Brahmanical position, wherein, as we have seen, an individual's existence was thought to be determined by his or her birth in a specific caste or gender. Source 2. Verses from the Upanishads. Here are two verses from the Chandogya Upanishad, a text composed in Sanskrit 6th century before Common Era. The nature of the self. The self of mind within the heart is smaller than paddy or barley or mustard or millet or the kernel of a seed of millet. The self of mind within the heart is greater than the earth, greater than the intermediate space, greater than heaven, greater than these worlds. The true sacrifice, this one, the wind that blows, this is surely a sacrifice. While moving it san- sanctifies all this, therefore it is indeed a sacrifice. How Buddhist texts were prepared and preserved. Take a look at figure 4.4, a Buddhist manuscript in Sanskrit, 12th century. The Buddha and other teachers taught orally through discussions and debate. Men and women, perhaps children as well, attended these discourses and discussed what they heard. None of the Buddha's speeches were written down during his lifetime. After his death, 5th 4th century BCE, his teachings were compiled by his disciples at a council of elders or senior monks at Vaisali, Pali for Vaishali in present day Bihar. These complications were known as Tipitaka, literally three baskets to hold different types of texts. They were first transmitted orally and then written and classified according to length as well as subject matter. The Vinaya Pitaka include rules and regulations for those who join the Sangha or monastic order. The Buddha's teachings were included in the Sutta Pitaka and the Abhidhamma Pitaka dealt with philosophical matters. Each Pitaka comprised a number of individual texts. Later, commentaries were written on these texts by Buddhist scholars. As Buddhists traveled to new regions such as Sri Lanka, other texts such as the Deepavamsa, literally the chronicle of the island, and Mahavamsa, the great chronicle, were written containing regional histories of Buddhism. Many of these works contain biographies of the Buddha. Some of the oldest texts are in Pali, while later compositions are in Sanskrit. When Buddhism spread to East Asia, pilgrims such as Faxian and Zhuangzi traveled all the way from China to India in search of texts. These they took back to their own country, where they were translated by scholars. Indian Buddhist teachers also traveled to faraway places carrying texts to dis- disseminate the teaching of the Buddha. Buddhist texts were preserved in manuscript for several centuries in monasteries in different parts of Asia. Modern translations have been prepared from Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan texts. Source 3. Fatalists and Materialists. Here is an excerpt from the Sutta Pitaka describing a conversation between King Ajatasattu, the ruler of Magadha, and the Buddha. On one occasion, King Ajatasattu visited the Buddha and described what another teacher named Makali Gosala had told him. Tota, why should hope by this virtue, by this penance I will gain karma, and the fool should by the same means hope to gradually rid himself of his karma. Neither of them can do it. Pleasure and pain, measured out as it were, cannot be altered in the course of samsara. samsara, transmigration. It can neither be lessened or increased, just as a ball of string will, when thrown unwind to its full length, so fool and wise alike will take their course and make an end of sorrow. And this is what a philosopher named Ajita Kesakambalin thought. There is no such thing, O king, as alms or sacrifice or offerings. There is no such thing as this world or the next. A human being is made up of the four elements. When he dies, the earthy in him returns to the earth, the fluid to water, the heat to fire, the wind to air, and his senses pass into space. The talk of gifts is a doctrine of fools, an empty lie. Fools and wise alike are cut off and perish. They do not survive after death. The first teacher belonged to the tradition of the Ajivikas. They have often been described as fatalists, those who believe that everything is predetermined. The second teacher belonged to the tradition of the Lokayathas, usually described as materialists. Texts from these traditions have not survived, so we know about them only from the works of other traditions. Do you think it is appropriate to describe these men as fatalists or materialists? Discuss what are the problems in reconstruction histories of ideas and beliefs when texts are not available or have not survived. Take a look at figure 4.5, an image of a Tirthankara from Mathura, 3rd century Common Era. Beyond world pleasure, the message of Mahavira, the basic philosophy of the Jainas, was already in existence in North India before the birth of Vardhamana, who came to be known as Mahavira in the 6th century BCE. According to Jaina tradition, Mahavira was preceded by 23rd other teachers or Tirthankaras, literally those who guide men and women across the river of existence. The most important idea in Jainism is that the entire world is animated. Even stones, rocks, and water have life, not injury to living beings, especially to humans, animals, plants, and insects, is central to Jaina philosophy. In fact, the principles of ahimsa emphasized within Jainism has left its mark on Indian thinking as a whole. According to Jaina teachings, the cycle of birth and rebirth is shaped through karma. Asceticism and penance are required to free oneself from the cycle of karma. This can be achieved only by renouncing the world. Therefore, monastic existence is a necessary condition of salvation. Jaina monks and nuns took 5 vows to abstain from killing, stealing, and lying, to observe celibacy, and to abstain from possessing property. Source 4, the world beyond the palace. Just as the Buddha's teachings were complied by his followers, the teachings of Mahavira were also recorded by his disciples. They were often in the form of stories which could appeal to ordinary people. Here is one example from a Prakrit text known as the Uttaradhyayana Sutta, describing how a queen named Kamalavati tried to persuade her husband to renounce the world. If the whole world and all its treasures were yours, you would not be satisfied, nor would all this be able to save you. When you die, O king, and leave all things behind, Dhamma alone, and nothing else will save you. As a bird dislikes the cage, so do I dislike the world. I shall live as a nun without offspring, without desire, without the love of gain, and without hatred. Those who have enjoyed pleasures and renounced them move about like the wind and go whenever they please, unchecked like birds in their flight. Leave your large kingdom, abandon what pleases the senses, be without attachment and property. Then practice severe penance, being fame of energy. Which of the arguments advanced by the Queen do you find most convincing? The spread of Jainism. Gradually, Jainism spread to many parts of India. Like the Buddhists, Jaina scholars produced a wealth of literature in a variety of languages Prakrit, Sanskrit, and Tamil. For centuries, manuscripts of these texts were carefully preserved in libraries attached to temples. Some of the earliest stone sculptures associated with religious traditions were produced by devotees of the Jaina Tirthankaras and have been recovered from several sites throughout the subcontinent. Discuss: is ahimsa relevant in the 21st century? Take a look at figure 4.6, a page from a 14th century Jaina manuscript. Can you identify the script? The Buddha and the quest for enlightenment. One of the most influential teachers of the time was the Buddha. Over the centuries, his message spread across the subcontinent and beyond, through Central Asia to China, Korea and Japan, and through Sri Lanka, across the seas to Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia. How do we know about the Buddha's teaching? These have been reconstructed by carefully editing, translating, and analyzing the Buddhist texts mentioned earlier. Historians have also tried to reconstruct details of his life from hagiographies. Many of these were written down at least a century after the time of the Buddha in an attempt to preserve memories of the great teacher. Hagiography is a biography of a saint or religious leader. Hagiographies often praise the saint's achievements and may not always be literally accurate. They are important because they tell us about the beliefs of the followers of that particular tradition. According to these traditions, Siddhartha, as the Buddha was named at birth, was the son of a chief of the Sakya clan. He had a sheltered upbringing within the palace, insulated from the harsh realities of life. One day he pursued his chartered to take him into the city. His first journey into the world outside was traumatic. He was deeply anguished when he saw an old man, a sick man, and a corpse. He realized in that moment that the decay and destruction of the human body was inevitable. He also saw a homeless mendicant who, it seemed to him, had come to terms with old age, disease, and death, and found peace. Siddhartha decided that he too would adopt the same path. Soon after, he left the palace and set out in search of his own truth. Siddhartha explored several paths, including bodily mortification, which led him to a situation of near death. Abandoning these extreme methods, he meditated for several days and finally attained enlightenment. After this, he came to be known as the Buddha or the Enlightened One. For the rest of his life, he taught Dhamma or the path of righteous living. Take a look at figure 4.7, a sculpture 200 Common Era from Amravati, Andhra Pradesh, depicting the departure of the Buddha from his palace. Discuss: if you did not know about the life of the Buddha, would you be able to tell what the sculpture depicts? The teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha's teaching have been reconstructed from stories found mainly in the Sutta Pitaka. Although some stories describe his miraculous powers, others suggest that the Buddha tried to convince people through reason and persuasion rather than through displays of supernatural power. For instance, when a grief stricken woman whose child had died came to the Buddha, he gently convinced her about the inevitability of death rather than bring her son back to life. These stories were narrated in the language spoken by ordinary people so that these could be easily understood. According to Buddhist philosophy, the world is transient anicca, and constantly changing. It is also soulless anatha, as there is nothing permanent or eternal in it. Within this transcendent world, sorrow, dukkha, is intrinsic to human existence. It is by following the path of modernization between sever penance and self indulgence that human beings can rise above these worldly troubles. In the earliest forms of Buddhism, whether or not God existed was irrelevant. Source 5. Buddhism in practice. This is an excerpt from the Sutta Pitaka and contains the advice given by the Buddha to a wealthy householder named Sigala. In 5 ways should a master look after his servants and employees: by assessing them work according to their strength, by supplying them with food and wages, by tending them in sickness, by sharing delicacies with them, and by granting leave at times. In 5 ways should the clansmen look after the needs of samanas, those who have renounced the world, and brahmanas, by affection in act and speech and mind, by keeping open house to them and supplying their worldly needs. There are similar instructions to Sigala about how to behave with his parents, teacher, and wife. Suggest what the instructions regarding parents, teacher, and wife may have been. Discuss. Compare the Buddha's advice to Sigala with Ashoka's advice to his subjects. Chapter 2. Do you notice any similarities and differences? The Buddha regarded the social world as the creation of human rather than of divine origin. Therefore, he advised kings and Gahapatis, see also chapter 2, to be human and ethical. Individual effort was expected to transform social relations. The Buddha emphasized individual agency and righteous action as the means to escape from the cycle of rebirth and attain self realization and nibbana, literally, the extinguishing of the ego and desire, and thus end the cycle of suffering for those who renounced the world. According to Buddhist tradition, his last words to his followers were: Be lamps unto yourselves, as all of you must work out your own liberation. Followers of the Buddha. Soon they grew a body of disciples of the Buddha, and he founded a Sangha, an organization of monks who too became teachers of Dhamma. These monks lived simply, possessing possessing only the essential requisites for survival, such as a bowl to receive food once a day from the laity. As they lived on alms, they were known as bhikkhus. In Delhi, only men were allowed into the Sangha, but later women also came to be admitted. According to Buddhist texts, this, were, this was made possible through the meditation of Ananda, one of the Buddha's dearest disciples, who persuaded him to allow women into the Sangha. The the Buddha's foster mother, Mahapajapati Gautami, was the first woman to be ordained as a bhikkhuni. Many women who entered the Sangha became teachers of Dhamma and went on to become theorists, or respected women who had attained liberation. The Buddha's followers came from many social groups. They included kings, wealthy men, and Gahapatis, and also humbler folk, workers, slaves, and craftspeople. Once within the Sangha, all were regarded as equal, having shed their earlier social identities on becoming bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. The internal functioning of the Sangha was based on the traditions of Ganas and Sanghas, where consensus was arrived at through discussions. If that failed, decisions were taken by a vote on the subject. Take a look at figure 4.8, a woman water carrier, Mathura, 3rd century, Common Era. This unique Buddhist text, part of the Sutta Pitaka, is a collection of verses composed by bhikkhunis. It provides an insight into women's social and spiritual experiences. Punna, a Dasi or slave woman, went to the river each morning to fetch water for his master's household. There she would daily see a Brahmana performing bathing rituals. One morning she spoke to him. The following are verses composed by Puna, recording her conversation with the Brahmana. I am a water carrier. Even in the cold, I have always gone down to the water, frightened of punishment or the angry words of high class women. So, what are you afraid of, Brahmana? That makes you go down to the water, though your limbs shake with the bitter cold. The Brahmana replied, I am doing good to prevent evil. Anyone young or old who has done something bad is freed by washing in water. Puna said, whoever told you you are freed from evil by washing in the water? In that case, all the frogs and turtles would go to heaven, and so would the water snakes and crocodiles. Instead, don't do that thing. The fear of which leads you to the water. Stop now, Brahmana. Save your skin from the cold. Which of the teachings of the Buddha are evident in this composition? Source 7. Rules for monks and nuns. These are some of the rules laid down in the Vinaya Pitaka. When a new felt blanket rug has been made by a bhikkhu, it is to be kept for at least 6 years. If after less than 6 years he should have another new felt blanket rug made, regardless of whether or not he had disposed of the first, then unless he has been authorized by the bhikkhus, it is so to be forfeited and confiscated. In case a bhikkhu arriving at a family residence is presented with cakes or cooked grain metal, he may accept 2 or 3 bowlfuls if he so desires. If he should accept more than that, it is to be confessed. Having accepted the 2 or 3 bowlfuls and having taken them from there, he is to share them among the bhikkhus. This is the proper course here. Should any bhikkhu having set out bedding in a lodging belonging to the Sangha or having had it set out and then on departing neither put it away nor have it put away, or should he go without taking leave, it is to be confessed. Can you explain why these rules were framed? Buddhism grew rapidly both during the lifetime of the Buddha and after his death, as it appealed to many people dissatisfied with existing religious practices and confused by the rapid social changes taking place around them. The importance attached to conduct and values rather than claims of superiority based on birth. The emphasis placed on metta, fellow feeling, and karuna, compassion, especially for those who were younger and weaker than oneself, were ideas that drew men and women to Buddhist teachings. Discuss, why do you think he, Dasi like Punna, wanted to join the Sangha? Stupas. We have seen that Buddhist ideas and practices emerged out of a process of dialogue with other traditions, including those of the Brahmanas, Jainas, and several others, not all of whose ideas and practices were preserved in texts. Some of these interactions can be seen in the ways in which sacred places came to be identified. Chaitya may also have been derived from the word chaita, meaning a funeral pyre, and by extension a funerary mound. Take a look at map 1, major Buddhist sites. From earliest times, people tended to regard certain places as sacred. These included sites with special trees or unique rocks, or sites of awe-inspiring natural beauty. These sites with small shrines attached to them were sometimes described as chaityas. Buddhist literature mentions several chaityas. It also describes places associated with the Buddha's life where he was born, Lumbini, where he attained enlightenment, Bodh Gaya, where he gave his first sermon, Sarnath, and where he attained Nibbana, Kushinagra. Gradually, each of these places came to be regarded as sacred. We know that about 200 years after the time of the Buddha, Ashoka erected a pillar at Lumbini to mark the fact that he has visited the place. Source 8. Why was stupas built? This is an excerpt from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, part of the Sutta Pitakas. As the Buddha lay dying, Anand asked him, "What are we to do, Lord?" With the remains of the Tathagata, another name for the Buddha. The Buddha replied, "Hinder not yourselves, Anand, by honoring the remains of the Tathagata. Be jealous, be intent on your own good." But when pressed further, the Buddhist said, at the fourth crossroads, they should erect a stupa, Pali for stupa, to the Thagata, and whosoever shall there place garlands or perfume or make a salutation there or become in its presence a calm of heart, there shall long be to them for a profit and joy. Look at figure 4.15 and see whether you can identify some of these practices. Why were stupas built? There were other places too that were regarded as sacred. This was because relics of the Buddha, such as his bodily remains or objects used by him, were buried there. These were mounds known as stupas. The tradition of erecting stupas may have been pre Buddhist, but they came to be associated with Buddhism since they contained relics regarded as sacred. The entire stupa came to be venerated as an emblem of both the Buddha and Buddhism. According to a Buddhist text known as the Ashoka Vadana, Ashoka distributed portions of the Buddha's relics to every important town and ordered the construction of stupas over them. By the 2nd century BC, a number of stupas, including those at Barhat, Sanchi, and Sarnath Mapwan, had been built. How were stupas built? Inscriptions found on the railings and pillars of stupas record donations made for buildings and decorating them. Some donations were made by kings, such as the Shatavahanas, others were made by guilds, such as that of the Ivory workers who financed part of one of the gateways at Sanchi. Hundreds of donations were made by women and men who mentioned their names, sometimes adding the name of the place from where they came, as well as their occupations and names of their relatives. Bhikkhus and bhikkhunis also contributed towards building these monuments. The structure of the stupa. The stupa is Sanskrit word meaning a heap, originated as a simple semicircular mound of earth, later called Anda. Gradually, it evolved into a more complex structure, balancing round and square shapes. Above the Anda was the Hermicum, a balcony like structure that represented the abode of the gods. Take a look at figure 4.9. A votive inscription from Sanchi. Hundreds of similar inscriptions have also been found at Barhat and Amravati. Discuss what are the similarities and differences between the plan of the Great Stupa, Sanchi figure 4.10a, and the photograph figure 4.3. What are the features of the buildings that are clearest in the plan? What are the features that are being best seen in the elevation? Take a look at figure 4.10a. Plan of the Great Stupa at Sanchi. A plan provides a horizontal perspective of a building. Take a look at figure 4.10b. An elevation of the Great Stupa, and elevation provides a vertical perspective. Arising from the Harmika was a mast called the Yashiti, often surmounted by a chhatri or umbrella. Around the mount was a railing separating the sacred space from the secular world. The early stupas at Sanchi and Barhat were plain except for the stone railings which resembled a bamboo or wooden fence, and the gateways which were richly carved and installed at the four cardinal points. Worshippers entered through the eastern gateway and walked around the mound in a clockwise direction, keeping the mound on the right. Imitating the sun's course through the sky, later the mound of the stupas came to be elaborately carved with niches and sculptures as at Amravati and Shaji Ki Dheri in Peshawar, Pakistan. Take a look at figure 4.11. The eastern gateway Sanchi noticed the vibrant sculpture. Discovering stupas, the fate of Amravati and Sanchi. Each stupa has a history of its own, as we have just seen. Some of these are histories of how they were built, but there are histories of discoveries as well, and let us now turn to some of these. In 1796, a local Raja who wanted to build a temple stumbled upon the ruins of the stupa at Amravati. He decided to use the stone, and though there might be some treasure buried in what seemed to be a hill, some years later a Buddhist official named Colin Mackenzie also see also chapter 7 visited the site. Although he found several pieces of sculpture and made detailed drawings of them, these reports were never published. In 1854, Walter Elito, the commissioner of Guntur, Andhra Pradesh, visited Amravati and collected several sculpture panels and took them away to Madras. These came to be called the Elite marbles after him. He also discovered the remains of the western gateway and came to the conclusion that the structure at Amravati was one of the largest and most magnificent Buddhist stupas were ever built. By the 1850s, some of the slabs from Amravati had begun to be taken to different places, to the Asiatic Society of Bengal at Calcutta, to the India office in Madras, and some even to London. It was not unusual to find these sculptures adorning the gardens of British administrators. In fact, any new official in the area continued to remove sculptures from the site on the grounds that earlier officials had done the same. Earlier, one of the few men who had a different point of view was an archaeologist named H. Cole. He wrote, it seems to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original works of ancient art. He believed that museums should have plaster cast facsimile of sculpture, whereas the originals should remain where they had been found. Unfortunately, Cole did not succeed in convincing the authorities about Amravati, although his plea for in situ preservation was adopted in the case of Sanchi. Why did Sanchi survive while Amravati did not? Perhaps Amravati was discovered before scholars understood the value of the finds and realized how critical it was to preserve things where they had been found instead of removing them from the site. When Sanchi was discovered in 1818, three of its four gateways were still standing. The fourth was lying on the spot where it had fallen, and the mound was in good condition. Even so, it was suggested that the gateway be taken to either Paris or London. Finally, a number of factors helped to keep Sanchi as it was, and so it stands. Whereas the Mahachaitya at Amravati is now just an insignificant little mound, totally denuded of its former glory. Discuss. Read section 1 again. Give your reason why Sanchi survived. In situ means on the spot. Take a look at figure 4.12, a section of the gateway. Do you think the sculptors at Sanchi wanted to depict a scroll being unfurled? Why did Sanchi survive while Amravati did not? Perhaps Amravati was discovered before scholars understood the value of the finds and realized how critical it was to preserve things where they had been found instead of removing them from the site. When Sanchi was discovered in 1818, three of its four gateways were still standing. The fourth was lying on the spot where it had fallen, and the mound was in good condition. Even so, it was suggested that the gateway be taken to either Paris or London. Finally, a number of factors helped to keep Sanchi as it was, and so it stands. Whereas the Mahachaitya at Amravati is now just an insignificant little mound, totally denuded of its former glory. Sculpture. We have just seen how sculptures were removed from stupas and transported all the way to Europe. This happened partly because those who saw them considered them to be beautiful and valuable and wanted to keep them for themselves. Let us look at some of these more closely. Stories in stone. You may have seen wandering storytellers carrying scrolls, charna chitras of cloth or paper with the pictures on them and pointing to the picture as they tell the story. Look at figure 4.13. At first sight, this sculpture seems to depict a rural scene with thatched huts and trees. However, historians who have carefully studied the sculpture at Sanchi identify it as a scene from the Vasantara Jatakam. This is a story about a generous prince who gave away everything to a Brahmana and went to live in the forest with his wife and children. As you can see in this case, historians often try to understand the meaning of sculpture by comparing it with textual evidence. Take a look at figure 4.13, a part of the northern gateway. Take a look at figure 4.14, far right, worshipping the Bodhi tree. Notice the tree, the seat, and the people around it. Figure 4.15, middle right, worshipping the stupa. Figure 4.16 below, setting in motion the wheel of dharma. Symbols of worship. Art historians had to acquire familiarity within hagiographies of the Buddha in order to understand Buddhist sculpture. According to hagiographies, the Buddha attained enlightenment while meditating under a tree. Many early sculptures did not show the Buddha in human form. Instead, they showed his presence through symbols. The empty seat figure 4.14 was meant to indicate the meditation of the Buddha, and the stupa figure 4.15 was meant to represent the Mahaparinibbana. Another frequently used symbol was the wheel. Figure 4.16. This stood for the first sermon of the Buddha, delivered at Sarnath. As is obvious, such sculptures cannot be understood literally. For instance, the tree does not stand simply for a tree but symbolizes an event in the life of the Buddha. In order to understand such symbols, historians have to familiarize themselves with the traditions of those who produced these works of art. Take a look at figure 4.17, the woman at the gate. 9.3, popular traditions. Other sculpture at Sanchi were perhaps not directly inspired by Buddhist ideas. These include beautiful women swinging from the edge of the gateway holding onto a tree. Figure 4.17, entirely scholars were a bit intrigued about this image, which seemed to have little to do with renunciation. However, after examining other literary traditions, they realized that it could be a representation of what is described in Sanskrit as a shalaba, shalabanchika. According to popular belief, this was a woman whose touch caused a tree to flower and bear fruit. It is likely that this was regarded as an auspicious symbol and integrated into the decoration of the stupa. The Shalabanchika motif suggests that many people who turned to Buddhism enriched it with their own pre Buddhist and even non Buddhist beliefs, practices, and ideas. Some of the recurrent motifs in the sculpture at Sanchi were evidently derived from these traditions. There are other images as well. For instance, some of the finest depictions of animals are found there. These animals include elephants, horses, monkeys, and cattle. While the Jatakas contain several animal stories that are depicted at Sanchi, it is likely that many of these animals were carved to create lively scenes to draw viewers. Also, animals were often used as a symbol of human attributes. Elephants, for example, were depicted to signify strength and wisdom. Take a look at figure 4.1, an elephant at Sanchi. Take a look at figure 4.19, Gajalakshmi. Take a look at figure 4.20, a painting from Ajanta. Note the seated figure and those serving him. Take a look at figure 4.21, is serpent at Sanchi. Paintings from the past. While stone sculpture survives the ravages of time and is therefore most easily available to the historian, other visual means of communication, including paintings, were also used in the past. Those that have survived best are on walls of caves, of which those from Ajanta, Maharashtra, are the most famous. The paintings at Ajanta depict stories from the Jatakas. These include depictions of courtly life, processions, men and women at work, and festivals. The artist used the techniques of shading to give a three-dimensional quality. Some of the paintings are extremely naturalistic. Another motif is that of a woman surrounded by lotuses and elephants, figure 4.19, which seemed to be sprinkling water on her as if performing an abhisheka or consecration. While some historians identify the figure as Maya, the mother of the Buddha, others identify her with a popular goddess, Gajalakshmi, literally the goddess of good fortune, who is associated with the elephants. It is also possible that devotees who saw these sculptures identified the figure with both Maya and Gajalakshmi. Compared to this serpent, which is found on several pillars, figure 4.21, this motif seems to be derived from popular traditions which were not always recorded in text. Interestingly, one of the earliest modern art historians, James Ferguson, considered Sanchi to be a center of tree and serpent worship. He was not familiar with Buddhist literature, most of which had not yet been translated, and arrived at the conclusion by studying only the images on their own. Discuss. Bone, terracotta, and metal can also be used for sculpture. Find out more about this. Take a look at figure 4.22, an image of the Buddha from Mathura, 1st century. The development of Mahayana Buddhism. By the 1st century CE, there is evidence of changes in Buddhist ideas and practices. Early Buddhist teachings had given great importance to self effort in achieving Nibbana. Besides, the Buddha was regarded as a human being who attained enlightenment and Nibbana through his own efforts. However, gradually the idea of a savior emerged. It was believed that he was the one who could ensure salvation. Simultaneously, the concept of the bodhisattva also developed. Bodhisattvas were perceived as deeply compassionate beings who accumulated merit through their efforts but used this not to attain nibbana and thereby abandon the world but to help others. The worship of images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas became an important part of this tradition. This new way of thinking was called Mahayana, literally the great vehicle. Those who adopted these beliefs described the older tradition as Hinayana or the lesser vehicle. Hinayana or Theravada. Supporters of Mahayana regarded other Buddhists as followers of Hinayana. However, followers of the older tradition described themselves as Theravadins, that is, those who followed the path of old respected teachers, the Theras. Take a look at figure 4.23. The Varaha or Boar avatar of Vishnu res- uh, rescuing the earth goddess Aihole, Karnataka, 6th century CE. What does the proportion of the figure suggest? The growth of Puranic Hinduism. The notion of a savior was not unique to Buddhism. We find similar ideas being developed in different ways within traditions that we now consider part of Hinduism. These included Vaishnavism, a form of Hinduism within which Vishnu was worshipped as the principal deity, and Shaivism, a tradition within which Shiva was regarded as the chief god, in which there was growing emphasis on the worship of a chosen deity. In such worship, the bond between the devotee and the god was visualized as one of love and devotion or bhakti. In the case of Vaishnavism, cults developed around the various avatars or incarnations of the deity. 10 avatars were recognized within the tradition. These were forms that the deity was believed to have assumed in order to save the world whenever it was threatened by disorder and destruction because of the dominance of evil forces. It is likely that different avatars were popular in different parts of the country. Recognizing each of these local deities as a form of Vishnu was one of the creating a more unified religious tradition. Some of these forms were represented in sculptures as were other deities. Shiva, for instance, was symbolized by the linga, although he was occasionally represented in human form too. All such representations depicted a complex set of ideas about the deities and their attributes through symbols such as head dresses, ornaments, and ayudas, weapons, or auspicious objects the deities hold in their hands, how they are seated, etc. To understand the meanings of these sculptures, historians have to be familiar with the stories behind them, many of which are contained in the Puranas, compiled by Brahmanas by about the middle of the first millennium CE. They contained much that had been composed and been in circulation for centuries, including stories about gods and goddesses. Generally, they were written in simple Sanskrit verses and were meant to be read aloud to everybody, including women and Shudras who did not have access to Vedic learning. Much of what is contained in the Puranas evolved through interaction amongst people, priests, merchants, and ordinary men and women who traveled from place to place sharing ideas and beliefs. We know, for instance, that Vasudeva Krishna was an important deity in the Mathura region. Over centuries, his worship spread to other parts of the country as well, building temples. Around the time that the stupas at sites such as Sanchi were acquiring their present form, the first temples to house images of gods and goddesses were also being built. The early temple was a small square room called the Garbhagriha with a single doorway for the worshipper to enter and offer worship to the image. Gradually, a tall structure known as the Shikara was built over the central shrine. Temple walls were often decorated with sculpture. Later temples became far more elaborate, with assembly halls, huge walls and gateways, and arrangements for supplying water. See also chapter 7. One of the unique features of early temples was that some of these were hollowed out of huge rocks. Take a look at figure 4.25, a temple in Deoghar, Uttar Pradesh, 15th century Common Era. Identify the remains of the Shikara and the entrance to the Garbhagriha. Take a look at figure 4.26. Vishnu reclining on the serpent Shashnag. Sculpture from Deogra, Uttar Pradesh, 5th century CE. Hollowed out of huge rocks as artificial caves. The tradition of building artificial cave was an old one. Some of the earliest, take a look at figure 4.27, entrance to a cave at Bharabar, Bihar, 3rd century BCE. Take a look at figure 4.28. Kailashnath Temple, Ellora, Maharashtra. This entire structure is carved out of a single piece of rock. Of these were constructed in the 3rd century BC on the road orders of Ashoka for renouncer who belonged to the Ajivika sect. This tradition evolved through various stages and culminated much later in the 8th century in the carving out of an entire temple, that of Kailasnath, a name of Shiva. A copper plate inscription records the amazement of the chief sculptor after he completed the temple at Ellora. Oh, how did I make it? Can we see everything? By now, you have had a glimpse of the rich visual traditions that existed in the past, expressed in brick and stone architecture, sculpture, and painting. We have seen that much has been destroyed and lost over the centuries. Nevertheless, what remains and has been preserved conveys a sense of the vision of the artist, sculptors, mason, and architects who created these spectacular works, yet do we always automatically understand what they wanted to convey? Can we ever know what these images mean to people who saw them and venerated them about 2000 years ago? Grappling with the unfamiliar, it will be useful to recall that when 19th century European scholars first saw some of the sculptures of gods and goddesses, they could not understand what these were about. Sometimes they were horrified by what seemed to them grotesque, grotesque figures with multiple arms and heads or with combinations of human and animal forms. These early scholars tried to make sense of what appeared to be strange images by comparing them with sculpture with which they were familiar that from ancient Greece, while they often found earlier Indian sculpture inferior to the works of Greek artists. They were very excited when they discovered images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas that were eventually based on Greek models. These were more often than not found in the northwest in cities such as Taxila and Peshawar, where Indo Greek rulers had established kingdoms in the 2nd century BCE. As these images were closest to the Greek statues these scholars were familiar with, they were considered to be the best examples of early Indian art. In effect, these scholars adopted a strategy we will frequently use, devising yardsticks derived from the familiar to make sense of the unfamiliar. If text and image do not match, consider another problem. We have seen that art historians often draw upon textual traditions to understand the meaning of sculptures. While this is certainly a far more efficient strategy than comparing Indian images with Greek statues, it is not always easy to use. One of the most intriguing examples of this is a famous sculpture along a huge rock surface in Mahabalipuram, Tamil Nadu. Take a look at figure 4 4.29, a bodhisattva from Gandhara. Note the clothes and the hairstyle. Clearly, figure 4.30 is a vivid depiction of a story, but which story is it? Artists have searched through the Puranas to identify it and are sharply divided in their opinions. Some feel that this depicts the descent of the river Ganga from heaven. The natural cleft through the center of the rock surface might represent the river. The story itself is narrated in the Puranas and the epics. Others feel that it represents a story from the Mahabharata Arjuna doing penance on the river bank in order to acquire alms, pointing to the central figure of an ascetic. Take a look at figure 4.30 is sculpture in Mahabalipuram. Describe any religious activity you have seen. It is permanently recorded in any form. Finally, remember that many rituals, religious beliefs, and practices were not recorded in a permanent visible form as monuments or sculpture or even paintings. This included daily practices as well as those associated with special occasions. Many communities and peoples may not have felt the need for keeping lasting records, even as they may have had vibrant traditions of religious activities and philosophical ideas. In fact, these peculiar instances we have focused on in this chapter are just the tip of the iceberg. Timeline. Major religious developments. 1500 to 1000 BC, early Vedic traditions, 1000 to 500, later Vedic traditions, 6th century, early Upanishad Jainism, Buddhism, 3rd century, first Tupas, 2nd century, development of Mahayana Buddhism, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and goddess cults, 3rd century, earliest temples. Timeline 2. Landmarks, the discovery and preservations of early monuments and sculptures. 19th century, 1814, founding of the Indian Museum, Calcutta. 1834, publication of essay on the architecture of the Hindus by Ram Raja. Cunningham explores the stupa at Sarnath. 1835 to 1842, James Ferguson surveys major archaeological sites. 1851, establishment of the Government Museum, Madras. 1854, Alexander Cunningham publishes Bilsa Tops, one of the earliest works on Sanchi. 1878, Rajendra Lala Mitra publishes Budgaya, the heritage of Sakya Muni. 1880, H. Cole appointed curator of ancient monuments. 1888, passing of the Treasure Trove Act, giving the government the right to acquire all objects of archaeological interest. 12th century, 1914, John Marshall and Alfred Foucher published the Monuments of Sanchi. 1923, John Marshall publishes the Conservation Manual. 1955, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru lays the foundation stone of the National Museum, New Delhi. 1989, Sanchi declared a World Heritage Site. Answer in 100 to 150 words. Write the ideas of the Upanishad thinkers different from those of the fatalists and materialists. Give reason of your answer. Summarize the central teachings of Jainism. Discuss the role of the Begums of Bhopal in preserving the stupa at Sanchi. Question number 4. Read this short inscription and short and answer. In the year 33 of the Maharaja Huviska, a Kushana ruler, in the first month of the hot season, on the 8th day, a bodhisattva was set up at Madhuvanaka by the Bhikkhuni Dhanavati, the sister's daughter of the Bhikkhuni Buddhamitha, who knows the Tipitaka, the female people of the Bhikkhu Bhala, who knows the Tipitaka together with her father and mother. A. How did Dhanavati date her inscription? B. Why do you think she installed an image of the Bodhisattva? C. Who were the relatives she mentioned? D. The Buddhist text did she know? E. From whom did she learn this text? Question number 5. Why do you think women and men joined the Sangha? Take a look at figure 4.31, a sculpture in Sanchi. Write a short essay about 500 words on the following. Question number 6. To what extent does knowledge of Buddhist literature help in understanding the sculpture at Sanchi? Question number 7. Figure 4.32 and 4.33 are two scenes from Sanchi. Describe what you see in each of them, focusing on the architecture, plants and animals, and the activities. Identify which one shows a rural scene and which an urban scene, giving reasons for your answer. Question number 8. Discuss the development in sculpture and architecture associated with the rise of Vaishnavism and Shaivism. Question number 9. Discuss how and why stupas were built. Take a look at figure 4.32 and take a look at figure 4.33. Map work. Question number 10. And on outline world map, mark the areas to which Buddhism spread. Trace the land and sea routes from the subcontinent to these areas. Project anyone. Question number 11. Of the region's tradition discussed in this chapter, is there any that is practiced in your neighborhood? What are the religious texts used today? And how are they preserved and transmitted? Are images used in worship? If so, are these similar to or different from those described in this chapter? Describe the buildings used for religious activities today, comparing them with early stupas and temples. Collect at least 5 pictures of sculpture or painting belonging to different periods and regions on the religious tradition described in this chapter. Remove their caption and show each one to two people and ask them to describe what they see. Compare these descriptions and prepare a report on your findings. Thank you.